Hey, folks. Eric Stacklebeck here. Welcome to a Watchman Newscast live stream. Apologies for the delay. Again, same deal yesterday. I said a certain time. We started a little late. Technical difficulties, folks. What can I say? You've heard it a million times in your life, right? But really, just tough getting the stream going the past 2 days, but all good. And we are here with you now, better late than ever. And we've got a lot to talk about, obviously. Unprecedented historic events, and in the worst way, in Israel. You may be wondering where I am right now. I am in Dallas, Texas. Tonight, a TBN special, our program at TBN. It is called War in Israel. It is an update on everything happening right now on the ground in Gaza and Israel. And yes, Israel declared war today for the first time since 1973, since the Yom Kippur war on Hamas. We're going to break that down right now, what it means. Iran's role is becoming more clear. And by the way, there could be ramifications, larger regional ramifications for that Iranian involvement. That's number one. Number two, as you saw in the title to this live stream, a full-blown hostage crisis, folks, with these hostages dragged into the bowels of hell by Hamas, including U.S. citizens, by the way. That's another wrinkle emerging here. And 1,100, at least 1,100 Israelis now confirmed dead and over 2,000 more wounded. You can see why many Israelis and many around the world are calling this Israel's 9/11. But real quick, I mentioned that Center Point special. When you are done with this live stream here on our YouTube channel, be sure to head over to TBN at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time for a 1-hour special, Center Point special, War in Israel. And throughout the day, folks, I've been interviewing top Israeli officials, people in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet. We interviewed one of the prime minister's top diplomatic advisors, a former Israeli general who was national security advisor for Netanyahu, and many more. So you will not want to miss this at 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight on TBN or on the TBN app. If you don't have the TBN app, please install it on your phone right now. But you won't miss that at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going in depth with some great guests, former U.S. military officials as well. But in the meantime, let's dig into this YouTube live stream. Now, here's the state of play right now. The key points I think that we want to hit on in terms of what is the state of play in Israel right now. Number one, I mentioned at the top, 1,100 Israelis now confirmed dead, over 2,000 wounded. Folks, you might say, well, you can't really compare that to 9/11. Some have said that. But folks, Israel is a nation of 9 million people. So to have 1,100 dead in such a small nation is much larger than the magnitude of 9/11 if you kind of multiply it out, right, in terms of sheer numbers. There's over 300 million Americans. There's 9 million Israelis. That's number one. Number two, the hostage crisis developing and the ramifications there in terms of Israel's response. Will Israel be hamstrung in some ways in its response because Hamas is literally, and Islamic Jihad, by the way, both Iranian proxies in Gaza, they are literally using these hostages as human shields. And folks, you've probably seen the footage by now on social media that Hamas has gleefully posted. These walking demons, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they've gleefully posted of Israeli men, women, children, the elderly, civilians dragged into Gaza on motorcycles, on golf carts even, from southern Israel. We're going to talk about the ramifications of that. Also, look, still in southern Israel, some house-to-house street fighting. There are still reportedly Hamas fighters on Israeli soil right now engaging in firefights with Israeli soldiers. And also the Hamas Iran factor, I should say. Today, when we talk about a regional broader war, Iran's involvement, today Hezbollah to the north also exchanged fire with Israel. Are we in danger of that entire Iranian-backed ring of fire igniting right now? And lastly, a point we should hit on, the U.S. has announced that it is sending warships to the Eastern Mediterranean, and the plot thickens. And the main reason for that is because the U.S. fears a multi-front war breaking out. And by the way, it has to be mentioned that just about 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration, as we covered here in the newscast, gift-wrapped Iran $6 billion, unfroze those Iranian assets, $6 billion, And I wonder where that money's going to go. I'm not saying it already made its way into the coffers of Hamas and Hezbollah, but eventually it will. That's first. And secondly, the message it sends, a message of weakness that only emboldens the Iranian regime and its proxies like Hamas. And oh, by the way, in previous rounds of U.S. basically sanctions relief to the Iranian regime in the past decade plus, you just know that the Iranian regime has used a good chunk of those funds not to build schools and playgrounds and hospitals in Iran, but to transit those funds, U.S. taxpayer dollars in some cases, into the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad to destroy schools and playgrounds and hospitals in Israel and throughout the region. We see that very clearly with the events unfolding in Gaza right now. So, needless to say, it's kind of like a fire hose. I said this yesterday, kind of like a fire hose right now, right? With all this information coming out from all directions, a little bit tough for even me to keep track of it, folks. And I live and breathe this stuff. But the main point here now is Israel's response, I believe. I read the casualty numbers to you 1,100 dead, over 2,000 injured, hostages, at least 100, including, again, I'm an American, some U.S. citizens among them as well. When Hamas basically raided several towns in southern Israel, there was 22 towns that were engaged in fighting at one point in the past 24 hours. But one event in particular, in terms of the hostage crisis, and it is a crisis, one event in particular stands out. There was essentially a music festival in the Negev desert. Remember, this was at the tail end of the Sukkot holiday, Simchat Torah, which is an important Jewish holiday that closes out the high holidays at the end of Sukkot. This was during Shabbat. There were young revelers, I guess you would say, in the Negev desert, hundreds of them, and Hamas came upon this desert party, and that's where many of the casualties apparently took place. Young people murdered in cold blood and dragged back to Gaza as hostages. What is Israel's response right now? Well, a few things. Israel is saying all the right things, that this will be a crushing blow against Hamas. And we said this on yesterday's live stream. And by the way, if you miss any of our newscast, our live streams, you can check them out in our archives. And just so you won't miss any, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. We're coming to you every day, Monday through Friday. And as you can see, when there's breaking, world-changing news, history-changing news like we're seeing over the weekend here in Israel, we're coming to you on Saturday and Sunday as well. But you don't want to miss any of our updates, so be sure to subscribe. It's absolutely free, and get those notifications so you know when we're popping up, like we are on this Sunday evening. But an unprecedented attack calls for an unprecedented response from the Israel Defense Forces. That is what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is promising. That is what, in my interviews today for the Center Point special, which again, 8 p.m. Eastern tonight on TBN and the TBN app, that is what one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's top advisors told me in our interview. It's what a former Israel Defense Forces international spokesperson told me as well, that Israel is in it to win it, so to speak, and a decisive victory will be achieved against Hamas. That's been the message out of the Israeli government. It's the right message, but folks, let me tell you, if there's not follow through on that message, listen, the current government already is going to have a lot of questions to answer about what appears to be a massive intelligence failure for Hamas to breach the security fence along the Gaza-Israel border and to carry out this massive, unprecedented massacre. Clearly, there was a major intelligence failure. The government's going to have to answer for this, apparently, just as it did after the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago. By the way, practically to the day, that surprise attack 50 years ago, then this surprise attack, October 6th, 1973, October 7th, 2023, dates that will live in infamy for Israel. In both cases, intelligence failure, surprise attack, Israel caught unaware and unprepared. And in 73, if you've watched the movie Golda, which was recently in theaters about Golda Meir, the former Israeli prime minister, there were hearings, and she had to give an accounting after the Yom Kippur War. How could this happen? And the current government, look, will eventually have to answer these questions, but that's down the road. In the meantime, and this should be the focus, the here and now, Israel achieve complete victory against Hamas. And complete victory isn't a strong enough term, folks. I mean a resounding, decisive, crushing blow, which cripples Hamas and puts this Iran-backed barbarian terror outfit in a position where it can never ever rear its head again in any sort of effective way, launching rockets, terror tunnels, cross-border raids like we've seen. Hamas must be completely destroyed and eliminated and wiped off the face of the map. Just as they vow to wipe Israel off the face of the map, some of their favorite rhetoric, Hamas needs to be completely and utterly destroyed. Now, I don't know what comes after Hamas in Gaza. Hamas has ruled Gaza with an iron fist since 2007. And every time Israel has one of these engagements with Hamas, everyone says, well, the devil we do know is better than the devil we don't know. No, quite literally the devil in this case. But people say, look, if you completely destroy Hamas, if you go in on the ground and just wipe them out, then what comes? Could we get something even worse? Well, I think Israel right now is and that's the international community, quote unquote, in Israel's ear and gnashing their teeth saying that. And that has always made Israel hold back and agree to these ceasefires. Then a few months later, we have another flare up. I think in this case, folks, in the wake of this, the magnitude of this, I don't think Israel is in any mood to let Hamas off the hook. And I believe if the current Israeli government does that, the current Israeli government, which is already, again, going to have to answer for a lot of things that happened here, is going to be facing a very angry, understatement, angry Israeli populace if Hamas is not crushed. This is the moment. And look, let's be honest. The world is anti-Israel, bar none, including in particular the Western mainstream media. Right now, in the wake of this, the world is mostly acting supportive of Israel and saying supportive things. But folks, you know as well as I, you've seen these previous Israeli campaigns in Gaza that after a few days of massive Israeli strikes, and by the way, Israel must invade on the ground in this case. I don't see any way around it. I'm not a military strategist, but clearly massive airstrikes have not worked for the past 15 years. It sets back Hamas a bit. Hamas rearms, and then Hamas is in a position with Iranian help where it's conducting brutal cross-border massacres, killing over 1,000 Israelis. So clearly what Israel has done up until now has not worked. Deterrence, deterring Hamas. It hasn't worked. 15 years, really 20 years, over 20, but 15 since the first major conflict between Israel and Hamas, late '08, early 2009. 15 years since then, it's been these almost quarterly flare-ups and week-long operations. Then Israel agrees to a ceasefire, and we've, quote, established deterrence. Well, clearly you haven't, because this was the worst attack against Israel ever by Hamas, and the worst really since the Yom Kippur War. Other than the 1948 War of Independence and the 73 Yom Kippur War, this is the worst. It's much worse than the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah War. And this is the first time since the 1948 War for Independence that we're seeing the enemies of Israel, Islamic jihadist terrorists, literally Islamic Jihad, the organization, and jihadis like Hamas, in the streets on Israeli soil, engaging in house-to-house street fighting against Israelis. We haven't seen this since 1948 on this kind of scale. So to say Israel has to conduct a ground invasion, I think, and take this in a new direction, I think is common sense. Unfortunately, we live in times where common sense is not so common, especially among members of the international mainstream media, in particular in the West, where I am sitting. But it's a new day, folks, and the status quo, and the media loves that term when it comes to Jerusalem, right, and the Temple Mount, the status quo. Israel, you must obey the status quo. Well, guess what? In this case, the status quo in Gaza, I believe, is going to be out the window. And I was mentioning a minute ago, this is Israel's window. If it's going to have a game-changing, decisive victory over Hamas, you have a few days here where the world will say, well, Israel, you do need what you need to do to defend yourself. And this was horrible. We condemn it. Then after about a week, you and I both know, as I was saying, the world starts to gnash its teeth and say, "Oh, Israel, this is horrible what you're doing in Gaza." And all of the images come out. Pallywood is what we've called some of these fake images, play on Hollywood, Pallywood, that Palestinian terror groups like Hamas use, fake imagery of children crying. Then you, with the real photo, you zoom out and it's a much different story. And Israel, and we might have some haters on this live stream right now, and I'll say it, and this is really going to make for some gnashing of teeth among the haters and the anti-Semites and the Israel haters. How's this? Israel, along with the United States, are the two most humane fighting forces in human history. I repeat, there has never been a military in human history more humane and with stricter rules of engagement than Israel and the United States as well. And there you have it. And that's a fact. But what does Israel do? A barbaric, unprecedented attack. Does it warrant an unprecedented response from Israel? I believe it does, and I believe you're going to see that. And if you don't see that, again, this Israeli government will not be in power much longer. Benjamin Netanyahu, clearly seen as Mr. Security, many have called him. I expect a very forceful, game-changing response from Bibi, no doubt. Folks, remember, things can never go back to the way they were. This is a complete Israel will never be the same after this. In many ways, the United States was never the same after this, after 9/11, I should say. Israel will never be the same after this. Never. This was a complete, massive, utter game changer. I'm not sure that Hamas knows what it unleashed here. And look, Israel is just right now recovering from this. And in the midst of it and getting its legs under it and getting its response ready, the cabinet's been meeting all day, the military's been meeting all day. I have friends right now, dear friends, some of my best friends in the world, getting called up to serve in the Israeli reserves. They'll be away from their families for some time. The entire country is mobilizing, just as it did with the Yom Kippur War. Folks, the similarities, not only the date called of Yom Kippur, it's eerie. Israel, the goal here cannot be just to establish Hamas once and for all. And people might say, well, what comes? I think Israel right now is in the frame of mind that we'll deal with what comes next after Hamas is crushed, and then we'll deal with it. And I mentioned that window Israel has in a few days. Bet your bottom dollars, folks, that the world will be howling and the pressure for a ceasefire will ramp up. We shall see what Israel does. I don't have an idea what they're going to do, but they're discussing it right now. And if it doesn't involve a ground invasion of Gaza, then I don't see how it's going to change the game from what we've had already over the past 15 years. Also, in speaking of game changers, U.S. warships heading to the Eastern Mediterranean. What do you think, folks? Could that be a game changer? Now, we've seen these shows of force, U.S. warships heading to the region. We've reported on this on the newscast many times over the past few months. But in my view, Iran and its proxies don't believe that there is any teeth behind these moves from the United States. Great symbolic moves with the U.S. trying to send a message. But to my mind, the Iranian regime says they're not really going to use this force, the United States. They're not going to use these warships. And why would they think that? Well, I think it's pretty simple. The United States is practically begging the Iranian regime for a new Iranian nuclear deal. The United States is releasing billions of dollars to the Iranian regime. The United States has been struck in Iraq and Syria, U.S. forces, by Iranian-backed forces over 80 times since Joe Biden took office, and the U.S. has responded exactly twice to these attacks. Iran has plotted to assassinate U.S. officials on U.S. soil, former U.S. officials on U.S. soil, and still the Biden administration is clamoring for a deal. So you can't really blame the Iranian regime. We can blame the Iranian regime for a lot of things, needless to say, but for doubting the seriousness of the U.S. sending warships. That should have been my point, to phrase that a little better. So I don't think that will be a game changer, because I don't think there's an intent to use military force on the part of the Biden administration. I think it's a symbolic gesture. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. I'm not sure if this thing continues to escalate, which brings us to the other potential game changer, the Ring of Fire, Iran, Hezbollah. Uh, is this a game changer for Iran in all the wrong ways? I mentioned that I'm not sure if Hamas knows what it unleashed right now. Does Iran understand what it has unleashed in terms of Israel's response? And will Israel respond against the Iranian regime directly? More on that in a minute. I'm going to hold that thought. I'm going to give everyone a shout out right now who's watching. We've got a very active live chat, thousands of people with us right now live here on the Watchman News Channel. Hello, everyone from around the world. And folks, we live in Bible times, prophetic times. Let God arise and may his enemies be scattered. I said it yesterday. I'll say it again. Hamas are the enemies of God Almighty. These are evil, barbaric, demonic terrorists. No other way to describe them, folks. These people are pure evil, and they are quick to run to evil at every turn. And when you have irredeemable evil, it must be crushed. And that's what we're looking at right now. This Hamas movement, there's no turning around. There's no Hamas coming to the negotiating table and laying down its arms, because then it wouldn't be Hamas. The only solution here is the complete destruction of this organization, which brings us to the Iranian regime, the main benefactor of this organization. Now, just before I joined this live stream, the Wall Street Journal reported, and I don't know what you think of the Wall Street Journal, but this is a fact. Hamas and Hezbollah spokespeople told the Wall Street Journal that Iran had a hand in planning this attack. Meetings in Beirut. Well, where have we heard that before? How many times over the past month have we reported here in the newscast that the Iranian regime, in particular Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps, along with Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, have been holding meetings in Beirut, Lebanon? Now, you didn't think those meetings were Girl Scout meetings, did you, where they were discussing going door to door and handing out cookies? No, they were discussing this, what we're seeing right now in real time. This was the ultimate plan. It was laid out. And Hamas and Hezbollah, they're so emboldened right now, folks. They're crowing about what they see as a massive victory over Israel and certainly a propaganda coup, and Israel exposed as weak. This is what they're saying. They're so bold and so confident right now that they're just boasting about it. They're saying, yeah, Iran helped us. And Iran is saying, yeah, we helped them and we support it. So much like the 1983 Marine barracks bombing, we've been talking about 50 years ago, Yom Kippur. What about 40 years ago, which, if I'm not mistaken, before 9/11, was the deadliest terror attack against U.S. assets, against U.S. citizens? The Beirut barracks bombing, 243 brave U.S. Marines slaughtered in cold blood by a Hezbollah terrorist sent by the Iranian regime. Iran's fingerprints on it. That's been confirmed, even by a former Iranian official recently. So we've got Iranian fingerprints on it. And the more we learn, I believe, folks, over the next few days and weeks, the more we will learn the extent of the involvement of Iran and Hezbollah. Which, again, I pose the question, and what do you think? You're listening to me now, but I want you all to continue to chat with each other and comment and questions and comments. I want to know what you think. That's why you're here on this live stream. You want to hear what I think? And guess what? I want to know what you think. Will Israel respond directly against Iran? Folks, I don't think there's any way they can in the wake of this. Now, what does directly mean? Does directly mean bombing Iran or an invasion of Iran or firing missiles at Iran? That's not what I'm saying. Think of what Israel has done over the past decade plus in terms of everything from cyber warfare against Iran, targeted assassinations of Iranian officials. I think of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the father, the godfather of Iran's nuclear program. Sabotage attacks against Iranian nuclear facilities, against Iranian ballistic missile facilities. The list goes on. Israel, I believe, is going to have to respond directly against Iran in some way. Direct, yet indirect, would be what I would think in the short term. But Iran cannot escape from this unscathed if you're Israel. Iran did. I mentioned 1983, the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut. Iran did escape from that unscathed. The Iranian regime was never held accountable for that. But in this case, Iran has to pay a price. And this morning, we had Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, saying, well, we haven't had any indication yet, no direct proof that Iran was involved. Oh, come on, Anthony. Really? And now Hamas and Hezbollah confirmed as much verbally that, yes, Iran helped us. Iran helped plan this in these planning meetings. And we told you this on the newscast. Common sense, again, that was what was happening in Beirut. It didn't take a genius to see it, that there was something big happening with repeated meetings in Beirut involving Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. And now you see the bitter fruits of that with what's been going on over the weekend. So Iran's fingerprints are on this. And what are Iran's motivations, by the way? Clearly to hurt Israel in profound ways and to further its goal of wiping Israel off the map. But is there another angle here, folks? I'd like your thoughts on this as well as you're all chatting with each other. And I'm glancing too. I'm seeing what y'all are saying. Saudi Arabia. We've been talking here recently on the newscast about Iran's reaction to potential normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Clearly, the Iranian regime was none too happy about this. No real overt, fiery threats that we've become accustomed to from the Iranian regime yet. But Iran, not naming names, not directly saying Saudi Arabia, but saying any government that makes peace with the Zionist entity is basically a traitor, a backstabber to the Muslim cause, to the Palestinian cause, et cetera, et cetera. Did Iran preemptively torpedo, essentially, an Israel-Saudi deal? Was that Iran's goal here, to make such a combustible, insane situation that it made peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia impossible, at least for now, because the situation right now is so fluid and unstable? Was that one of Iran's goals here, one of its motivating factors, to put a dent in that Israel-Saudi deal and to drive Saudi Arabia away? One of two things can come here. The Saudis could be spooked by this and kind of back off, or the Saudis could full on maybe embrace Israel and say, look, we stand against terror. I don't think this is going to happen, but they could maybe not embrace Israel, but stand with Israel in terms of, hey, we're completely against this. The Saudis and even the UAE, Bahrain, these Abraham Accords nations will always kind of straddle a middle road in these situations, sadly, because of domestic consumption and the messaging for their domestic audiences. But whether that Saudi-Israel normalization that seemed like it was at the doorstep, right? Was Iran motivated in part by that to try and kill that potential peace deal? And look, remember, Iran and Saudi Arabia normalized relations back in March. For me, I consider that a non-aggression pact on the part of the Saudis that, frankly, the Saudis agreed to out of a position of weakness because they felt the heat. They looked at the U.S. and saw weakness in the leadership in the United States. They looked at Israel, saw a nation divided, and they said, wow, if you can't beat them, join them. They're not joining with Iran. They don't subscribe to Iran's ideology. They're bitter enemies. The powerhouse of the Shia world and a nation that views itself as the powerhouse of the Sunni world. Nonetheless, the Saudis said, we're kind of in a position of weakness here. We can't rely on the U.S. The situation in Israel has become unstable politically. The Saudis see this as a non-aggression pact with Iran. Is that out the window if Israel and Saudi Arabia develop relations? And again, is Iran preempting that? Another fast. Lastly, Hezbollah firing rockets today. Not firing rockets, I'm sorry, but exchanging some shelling along the northern. Why did Hezbollah hold its fire? It seemed, and I'm glad it did, thank God, that another front wasn't open, but it would seem this was a perfect opportunity perhaps for Hezbollah, with Israel completely surprised here, clearly, in the south. And massive carnage, and Israel completely focused on the south right now, sending forces there, reserve soldiers, everything else. You would think maybe this was the time where Hezbollah would finally activate it. Iran has held Hezbollah in reserve since 2006 for 17 years, largely, and basically holding Hezbollah in reserve for a day to come. I've called it the Great Northern War. Some believe it's Psalm 83. And what are your thoughts on this prophetically, folks? By the way, to me, another birth pang, wars and rumors of wars. This could expand into a multi front war. That ring of fire, that entire Iranian backed ring of fire could ignite. Uh, Hezbollah could get into this. The Houthis in Yemen, even those Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. What happens in eastern Jerusalem? What happens in the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, which the world knows as the West Bank? Do things ignite there, spurred on once again by the Iranian regime, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad? Is this the moment where this battle in Gaza mushrooms and expands into something much larger and this becomes a regional war? It is a possibility. That's and look, the extent of this, the daring on the part of Hamas, the boldness on the part of Hamas to do this. I don't want to say daring because that sounds complimentary. The emboldening of Hamas, I should say, to do this. And you have to wonder, I don't really think you have to wonder. I think clearly the divisions inside Israel helped embolden Hamas. They saw Israel as a house divided and saw Israel as vulnerable during this time of great political upheaval and demonstrations in Israel. I'm not blaming the demonstrators for this before someone runs away with that. But I'm just saying, if you're on the outside looking in, you might say, wow, Israel looks pretty divided right now. This could be a good time to attack. If you're Israel's enemies, logically, they said as much. Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Iranian regime. They said they were gloating over all the protests and the division in Israel. So, likely a factor in the timing of this, right? We'll see where this goes, folks. A lot of this may depend on Israel's response. Now, if Israel has, I don't want to say a half-hearted response, but again, status quo, business as usual, airstrikes and ceasefire after a week, wow, will Iran and Hezbollah be emboldened? They'll say, we just carried out, our ally and fellow proxy Hamas just carried out the most horrific terror attack in Israel's history, what may turn out to be the bloodiest, the highest death tolls in Israel's history. And all Israel did was carry out some airstrikes and agree to a ceasefire after a week. You think they're emboldened now? How much will a weak Israeli response, where Hamas is left to fight another day, embolden Hezbollah and Iran? They'll say, wow, Israel's really weak. They just showed, look what we just did. We were probing. In many ways, this was probing and testing the waters for Iran and Hezbollah, the two big fish in that Iranian axis. Again, Iran has held Hezbollah in reserve. Hezbollah's watching to see how Israel responds. Number one, to see what Hamas could get away with, and they've gotten away with a lot. Again, if you're just joining us, and if you missed any of this, this will be on our channel as soon as it's done, as soon as it wraps, the entire live stream. If you're just joining us, there are still firefights in southern Israel with Hamas fighters and Islamic Jihad fighters, presumably, on the ground in Israeli communities. Now, they're mostly under control, but there's still a presence. Israel's pushing them out, but this has gone on now for close to 48 hours. Secondly, at least 1,100 Israelis dead, over 2,200, probably 2,500, I think at this point, injured, and some 100 hostages dragged back into the bowels of Gaza. So if Israel's not going to respond to this with unprecedented force and utterly destroy Hamas, when will they? And Hezbollah and Iran are watching. Folks, just as the enemies of America were watching Afghanistan and the show of weakness there in August 2021, Israel's enemies are watching right now. Hamas was, in some ways, a trial balloon. As horrible, horrific as this is, it could be magnitudes worse if this were Hezbollah, which is a much more advanced fighting force than Hamas. 150,000 rockets and missiles at least at its disposal, tens of thousands of fighters. The list goes on. So, folks, I got to wrap it up now. Again, we had a lot to talk about. We covered a lot. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, all of Israel, southern Israel. Pray for the hostages that they return home safely. Pray for the utter defeat and God's judgment upon these terrorists, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Iranian regime, Hezbollah. Pray for Israel right now, folks. And tonight we will be, again, coming to you live on Centerpoint TBN, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, with an hour-long special breaking all this down more. Israel at war. It's overwhelming, folks, in many ways. Israel is my second home. Many dear friends of mine are on the front lines right now. Many communities I've spent time in the South have been ravaged. People I know, um, prayer works. Keep it up. Let God arise and let his enemies be scattered. Until 8 p.m. Eastern, TBN and the TBN app. Thanks for joining us. God bless you. And remember, now more than ever, never hold your peace.